Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving right into the real-world historical, political, and frankly, deeply personal context that forged George Orwell's terrifying masterpiece, 1984. We're going to break down exactly how a book about a dystopian future was, in reality, a mirror reflecting the massive traumas of the mid-20th century. So, let's get into it. You do not exist. Think about how chilling that concept is. That phrase captures the absolute core of Orwell's terror. You see, it wasn't just the physical violence or the threat of bombs that kept him awake at night. It was the complete erasure of facts. He was profoundly terrified by a totalitarian mindset's ability to just obliterate objective truth, to literally rewrite reality itself. And this wasn't a sudden epiphany. Listen to this. If he says that 2 and 2 are 5, well, 2 and 2 are 5. Orwell actually wrote that way back in 1942. So the immense dread we feel when reading 1984 wasn't just some sudden thought he had while writing the book in 1948. It was really the culmination of a long fuse of anxiety stretching back years. Which brings us to Section 1, the long fuse, trauma and truth. It's almost like Orwell's own life functioned as a blueprint for the novel. Back in 1936, he fought and was actually shot in the throat during the Spanish Civil War. There, he witnessed firsthand how newspapers reported pure fiction just to fit party lines. Then, flash forward to 1941, he's actively creating wartime propaganda for the BBC. By 1943, he's watching the Tehran Conference, basically observing world leaders carve up the globe like a pie. All of these raw, real-world experiences, they provided the grim building blocks for the nightmare he'd eventually write down in 1948. Section 2. Racing the Clock, the Isle of Jura. Now, here's where the story gets incredibly human and tragic. Orwell retreated to this remote, freezing, windswept farmhouse on the Scottish Isle of Jura to write. And the harsh reality is, he was actively dying of tuberculosis. He was suffering from collapsed lungs, coughing fits that left him completely gasping for air. And when he couldn't find anyone willing to travel to this isolated island to type up his manuscript, he just sat in bed, furiously typing it himself on a decrepit typewriter. He was literally racing against his own death. That sheer, undeniable physical agony bled directly into the bleak, exhausted world of his main character, Winston Smith. 85%. So what does that number mean? Well, it represents the proles, the largely ignored, unmonitored, working-class majority of Oceania. Orwell actually viewed the proles with this incredibly complex mix of deep empathy, but also some distinct middle-class prejudice. On one hand, he saw them as the only genuine hope for a revolution, people with warm hearts and strong arms. But on the other hand, he simultaneously depicted them as easily distracted simpletons, kept in line with cheap beer, gambling, and songs cranked out by machines. Section 3. Blueprints of a Dystopia, Shaping the Nightmare. Okay, so the world of 1984 is carved into 3 permanently warring superstates: Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. But here's the thing, this wasn't entirely Orwell's invention. It was heavily inspired by that 1943 Tehran Conference we mentioned, where Allied leaders divided up the post-war world. It was also inspired by the American writer James Burnham. Burnham had this whole theory about managerialism, predicting the world would eventually be ruled by amoral, bureaucratic elites locked in this permanent, unwinnable stalemate. Orwell basically took that geopolitical theory and made it the absolute bedrock of his novel. It's really fascinating to contrast Orwell's dark world with other famous dystopias. If you look at earlier works like Zamyatin's We or Huxley's Brave New World, they warned of hedonistic societies, places controlled by docile pleasure, promiscuity, and pills. But Orwell, he went the complete opposite route. He firmly believed that a purely hedonistic society just lacked the psychological drive to endure. He felt regimes needed struggle, self-sacrifice, and fear to survive. That's why 1984 is so sadomasochistic. It's driven by pure power and pain, or, as the book famously puts it, a boot stamping on a human face forever. You hear people call 1984 science fiction all the time, but actually, scratch that. It really isn't. Every single piece of technology in the novel, from the two-way televisions to the surveillance devices, already existed in some embryonic form by 1948. Orwell didn't rely on flying cars or alien technology. He just used the mundane tech of his present day. And honestly, that makes the warning about surveillance and control far more chilling, because it was already entirely possible. Section 4. The Mechanics of Power, Myth versus Reality. At the absolute core of 1984 is this concept of doublethink, the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in your mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. Orwell actually pulled this straight from his intense frustration with the mental gymnastics of British intellectuals during the war. Like, communists who fiercely opposed Nazi Germany would suddenly become pacifists overnight when the Hitler-Stalin Pact was signed, and then they became fiercely anti-Nazi again the exact moment Russia was invaded. Orwell took that very real political hypocrisy and magnified it into Osania's absolute, terrifying control over the human mind. Now, get ready for a darkly humorous piece of trivia behind all this horror. Room 101. It's the ultimate torture chamber in the Ministry of Love, right? The room containing your absolute worst fear. Well, its real-world inspiration wasn't a medieval dungeon. It was a thoroughly mundane, bureaucratic conference room at the BBC where Orwell had to sit through endless, soul-crushing editorial meetings during the war. It's just wild to think about how he transformed everyday office misery into legendary literary horror. And remember that 2 + 2 = 5 quote from earlier? That wasn't just some random mathematical abstraction he came up with. It was an actual slogan used in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s. They printed it on posters to urge workers to complete a 5-year industrial plan in just 4 years. Orwell read about this and saw the terrifying paradox in this, what he called nose-thumbing arithmetic. He took a literal piece of state propaganda and turned it into the ultimate symbol of psychological destruction, a place where the state gets to dictate what reality itself actually is. To explain exactly what motivates this regime, Orwell created the fictional ideology of oligarchical collectivism, which gets laid out in the novel's Secret Goldstein book. He describes it as a system where a ruling elite abolishes private property, but definitely not to achieve equality. No, they do it to jointly centralize absolute power and wealth for themselves. It is a bleak, dark philosophy of power purely for power's sake, using perpetual war to destroy any surplus goods and keep the masses uneducated and impoverished. Let's shift gears to Section 5, where Orwell went wrong, the economic critique. So what happens when we compare Orwell's predictions to how historical reality actually played out? Well, Christopher Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs points out that Orwell's extreme pessimism really stemmed from his economic blind spots. You see, Orwell firmly believed that capitalism was doomed to collapse and that totalitarian managerial rule was just inevitable worldwide. But historical reality went a completely different direction. Post-war liberal democracies and market economies actually thrived, while it was the centrally planned socialist economies that ultimately collapsed under their own weight. The core of the IEA's argument here is this. Orwell did not understand that the inefficiencies of central planning caused poverty and were indirectly responsible for tyranny. They argue that Orwell made a mistake in attributing the poverty and shortages he saw in totalitarian states to some perfectly executed deliberate plan by an all-powerful elite. From the IEA's perspective, those shortages weren't some evil genius mechanism of control. They were simply the natural, chaotic failures of centralized economics. Section 6. The Modern Echo, 1984 today. Think about the telescreen for a second. Today, we willingly carry devices around in our pockets that track our locations, our conversations, and our habits. As researchers like Shoshana Zuboff point out about this concept of surveillance capitalism, and as we can literally see with the massive data gathered by modern autonomous vehicles, the monitoring absolutely hasn't stopped. It's everywhere. Which really makes you wonder. Has Big Brother disappeared, or has he simply changed his business model from state terror to data profit? I'm going to leave you to ponder that one. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer, and keep learning.